The lights inside Elgin Memorial Hospital never completely darkened, not even at 4 in the morning. Remy Bouchard had learned that in his first week on the job, the way the overnight hours didn't mean quiet so much as they meant a different kind of noise. Monitors instead of voices. Corridor ventilation instead of elevator doors. The slow, uneven rhythm of a building that never slept because the people inside it couldn't afford to. He made his rounds through the east wing at 4:30 with his thermos empty and his boots barely sounding against the floor. 3 years on the overnight security rotation had given him the building's geography the way long familiarity gives you a house. Not consciously, just in the body, in the way your feet know where the floor dips before your eyes do. His badge said his name in small block letters, R. Bouchard. Most people looked past it without stopping, which was fine. That was more or less the point. At home, in the spare bedroom of his mother's house across the city, his 9-year-old daughter, Isla, was asleep. He knew because he'd called at midnight, and his mother had said, "Still asleep." She didn't even move when I looked in. Isla slept hard when she was tired, and Tuesday nights were always hard because she had swimming lessons after school and came home with her hair still damp and her eyes already closing before dinner was finished. Remy pictured her the way he always did during the long, quiet stretches of his shift. Small and tangled in her blankets, one arm around the stuffed rabbit she'd named Captain, trusting completely that morning would come and her father would be there. He turned the corner toward the administrative wing and stopped. The lights in the executive corridor were on, all of them. Not the dim maintenance setting that usually held overnight, but full fluorescent brightness flooding under the boardroom doors 30 meters ahead. Voices too, low and tight, the kind people use when they're trying not to be overheard and failing anyway. Remy checked his watch, 4:37 a.m. The hospital board didn't meet at 4:37 in the morning unless something had already gone wrong. He already knew what this meeting was, in the general way that people who move through a building invisibly often know things before they're announced. He'd heard it in fragments over the past 2 weeks. Accountants arriving late with rolling luggage, lawyers in conference rooms with the blinds drawn, the CEO's assistant ordering catering for meetings not on the public calendar. Elgin Memorial was being sold. That was what the fragments added up to. 53 years of community medicine, the hospital that had treated 2 generations of the city's families being transferred to a private health corporation called Meridian Health Group out of Toronto. Meridian owned 11 other hospitals. It had turned 9 of them profitable in 5 years, and the nurses' union had been loudly unhappy about how for 4 of those 5 years. It wasn't Remy's business, he had his rounds. He was moving past the boardroom doors, keeping his footsteps quiet out of habit, when a loose sheaf of papers slid from underneath the door and fanned out across the corridor floor. He almost kept walking. The page closest to his boot carried a specific kind of number, not a budget line or a personnel figure, a patient census average. Annual average daily occupancy, adjusted for same-day procedures. He could tell what it was by its format before he could read the value itself. The way a former life doesn't disappear, it only goes quiet. He stood still for longer than he should have. The number didn't match, not by a small margin, by a margin large enough to mean something beneath it was built on wrong ground. Remy knew this figure the way he knew it because 3 years ago, during the worst stretch of his life, his daughter Isla had been admitted and discharged from this hospital same day on 2 separate occasions for a respiratory condition she eventually outgrew. Both times, her file had initially generated 2 billing entries before the hospital's own correction process caught the duplication. He had kept every page of the paperwork. He kept all paperwork. It was the particular habit of a man who had spent nearly a decade in systems where a single misplaced decimal changed the conclusion of a clinical trial. The census figure lying on the floor was using the wrong denominator. Same-day discharges were being counted inside the inpatient's average rather than excluded from it, which meant the occupancy rate looked 22% lower than it actually was, which meant the operating efficiency looked far worse than the real picture, which meant the sale price and the urgency driving it were built on a foundation that someone had either made a catastrophic error constructing or had constructed deliberately wrong. He stood in the corridor and breathed and thought about Isla asleep across the city. Then he knocked on the boardroom door. The silence when he opened it lasted long enough that he could hear the ventilation system in the ceiling. 8 people sat around the long table. Carolyn Devereux stood at its head. Remy recognized her from the hospital's annual report that hung framed in the main lobby, though she looked different in person at this hour, the composed public-facing version replaced by something rawer. A woman who had been awake through too many hours making a decision she didn't want to make. Beside her sat Craig Halden, the hospital's CFO, in a charcoal suit that looked like it had been put on in poor light. Around the rest of the table, board members, legal counsel, and two people Remy didn't recognize who had the particular stillness of those who had flown in from somewhere else the night before. Craig reacted first. His voice had the easy authority of someone accustomed to making people apologize for existing. "This floor is restricted after hours. Who authorized access?" Remy didn't step back. His pulse was fast, but his voice came out level. "The document under the door, ma'am." He looked at Carolyn. "The census average on page 3. I think the same-day adjustment is wrong." Craig's expression shifted toward contempt in the deliberate way of someone performing it. "Your security." "Yes." Remy held the man's gaze, "but the patient volume figure your occupancy calculation is using, it isn't excluding same-day procedure discharges. It's counting them as inpatient days." One of the two unknown visitors shifted in his chair, Remy noticed. Craig leaned back with the slow ease of a man performing confidence. "Our financial modeling has been reviewed by 2 independent audit firms." Then one of them missed the denominator adjustment. Remy looked at Carolyn. "If you recalculate with same-day discharges excluded from the average daily census, as per standard Ontario reporting protocol, the occupancy rate changes, and if the occupancy rate changes, the operating loss projections change with it, significantly." The room went quiet in a different way. Carolyn looked at him with the stillness of someone encountering something unexpected and choosing not to dismiss it before they understood it. "Come here," she said. Craig straightened. "Carolyn." "I said come here." The analyst at the far end of the table was a young woman named Dara Kim who had been awake since 2 in the morning rebuilding figures for the signing package. She opened the source data on her laptop without being asked, because she was the kind of person who ran the numbers before she ran her mouth. Within 4 minutes, she looked up with an expression she couldn't quite flatten. "He's right about the denominator." Craig's jaw tightened. "That's a minor formatting variance. It's a 22.6% shift in adjusted occupancy." Dara's voice was careful, but her hands on the keyboard had accelerated. "Which changes the 3-year operating margin from -8% to..." She stopped and typed faster. "-1.4. Which is not the same as insolvent," said the older board member at the far end of the table, a man who had been quiet all morning and suddenly had reason not to be. Craig stood. "One input error does not invalidate an entire..." "Check the capital reserve threshold calculation," Remy said quietly. Everyone looked at him again. He kept his eyes on Dara's screen. "If the occupancy figure is wrong, the capital reserve calculation is tied to the same base. It would move you below Meridian's trigger threshold. It's probably written into the sale conditions as the mechanism that makes the sale appear necessary." Dara was already there. The sound she made was barely a word. She turned the laptop toward Carolyn. The room stopped. What followed had the compressed, airless quality of a crisis that has already been decided and is only working out how to tell itself. Dara and a second analyst pulled every linked spreadsheet, and with each one the picture shifted. The operating loss projection narrowed. A debt service coverage ratio moved. A capital expenditure reserve, classified as unrecoverable, turned out to reference an insurance payout that had cleared 8 months earlier and simply hadn't been updated in the consolidated model. None of these things alone reversed the situation. Together they changed the story being told to the board. Craig offered explanations for each finding. He had an explanation ready before Dara had finished reading each one aloud, the kind of fluency that only comes from rehearsal. Carolyn noticed. She had been watching him for 40 minutes, and she noticed. "Who built the model?" she asked. "Finance division, under my oversight." "Who set the parameters for the same-day adjustment?" A pause, small but present, standard practice across the sector. Remy had said very little for the past half hour, answering only when someone asked him to confirm something, keeping himself as close to invisible as a man can be while standing in the center of a boardroom. But the revision timestamps had caught something he hadn't said yet. "The capital reserve formula," he said. "When was it last changed?" Dara checked. 6 weeks ago. "Who changed it?" She looked at the access log, then she looked at Craig. Craig's expression didn't break, but something behind it did. 6 weeks ago, Carolyn said quietly, is when Meridian's preliminary offer was submitted. The ventilation system continued its low hum. Nobody answered. Carolyn straightened slowly. When she spoke again, her voice had taken on a different quality. Not louder, but denser. Something compressed inside it. "Nobody signs anything," she said. "Nothing leaves this building." Craig stepped forward. There are lawyers downstairs who flew in from Toronto last night. Meridian's signing team arrives at 8. You cannot simply... Then they wait. Carolyn looked at Remy directly for the first time, as though she were seeing him clearly and making a decision about what she saw. What's your name? Remy Bouchard. How long have you worked here? 3 years. And before that? The question opened the door he usually kept shut. He answered simply, pharmaceutical research, systems analysis, clinical trial modeling. I left the field. Craig gave a short sound that wasn't quite a laugh, and now he's auditing hospital governance from the corridor. Carolyn ignored him. Why did you leave? Remy looked at the window. Outside, the city sat still and dark. My wife got sick and then she died, and after that I had a daughter who needed a father who came home on time. The room held that the way rooms hold certain things, not with ceremony, just with silence. You stay, Carolyn said to Remy. We're not done. By 6 in the morning, the corridor outside the boardroom had filled with a quiet urgency that moved through the building the way things move when people can feel something happening without being told what it is. Nurses arriving for early shifts noticed the lights still burning on the administrative floor. Someone said the sale had been delayed. Someone else said the CEO hadn't left overnight. Inside, the picture being assembled had become something harder to ignore than a modeling error. Dara had traced the revision history across 6 linked files. 5 of them showed manual formula overrides in the 2 weeks following Meridian's preliminary offer. The changes were not corrections. They were substitutions, accurate archived values replaced with new figures that consistently moved the hospital's financial position toward the worse end of every range. Errors go in both directions, the older board member said. He had been taking handwritten notes for an hour, and his handwriting had gotten smaller and more deliberate the further he got. These all go the same direction. Craig said nothing for the first time. Carolyn had begun reviewing the asset register herself, scrolling through the equipment valuation section with the careful focus of someone who had stopped trusting what they were being handed. The diagnostic imaging equipment, she said. Dara found it. The suite was listed at residual depreciated value, but the hospital had commissioned an independent appraisal 14 months earlier for a capital campaign donor prospectus, a document that used a figure $4.3 million higher. Check whether that figure appears in the Meridian sale conditions, Remy said. Dara found the relevant clause in under 2 minutes. The sale conditions included a post-closing asset adjustment mechanism with a cap set just below the correct appraised value of the equipment. Meridian had written the clause already knowing the higher number existed, and had structured the mechanism so that number would be excluded. Someone at the table said the word they'd all been avoiding. Carolyn said it more carefully, with less emotion and more consequence. This isn't mismanagement. This is collusion. Craig's composure finally showed its edges. You have no evidence of any communication between me and Meridian outside of board authorized. Blake Osmond. Carolyn held up a printed page her assistant had quietly brought in 20 minutes earlier, while Craig had been watching Dara's screen. Meridian's acquisitions director. Your executive communication logs show 11 contacts with him over the past 6 weeks, outside of any board-authorized channel. The 2 visitors from out of town looked at each other and then simultaneously at no one, which was its own kind of answer. The Meridian signing team arrived at 8 as scheduled and was held in a ground-floor meeting room with the polished efficiency of an assistant who had been told exactly what to say. Blake Osmond called Carolyn's mobile at 8:14 and again at 8:31. She answered the second call. The materials we've been working from contain significant errors, she said. We're reviewing the full document set. The signing is postponed. A pause. Our team has other commitments. So do 412 employees of this hospital, Carolyn said, and ended the call herself. Craig was escorted to a separate office at 8:45 by hospital legal counsel and informed that his access credentials were being suspended pending formal review. He went quietly. He had run out of explanations that arrived fast enough. By 9 o'clock, federal regulators had been contacted. By 9:30, the board had voted 7-1 to reject the Meridian sale and commission an independent forensic audit of 18 months of financial statements. Remy was still in the boardroom when the vote concluded. His shift had ended 2 hours ago. He hadn't eaten. His thermos had been empty since just past midnight. He was thinking about Isla's afternoon pickup and whether his mother could manage it if he needed more time, when Carolyn sat down across from him at the long table for the first time all morning. She looked tired in the way of someone who had been running hard and was allowing themselves, finally, to stop. Who taught you to read these models? She asked. I spent 8 years building them, he said. Clinical trial cost analyses, regulatory submission packages for Health Canada. It's the same work in the end. Numbers are numbers. Why come back to it tonight? He thought about the question honestly. The figure in the corridor was wrong, he said. I could see it. I didn't know who to tell, but I knew that if I didn't tell anyone, I would always know I had seen it and done nothing. He paused. And this is where I brought my daughter when she was sick. This is where a lot of people bring their children. Carolyn looked at the table, then back at him. I want to offer you a position, she said. Financial systems oversight. Working with the audit team to rebuild what's been compromised and establish controls that prevent this from happening again. Remy looked at his hands. I have a daughter. I pick her up from school every afternoon without exception. Then you pick her up. She gets sick. Children her age get sick in November and stay sick for 3 weeks. Then you work from home those weeks. He looked up. I'm not negotiating my own conditions first. Carolyn waited. Before any of this moves forward, Remy said, the patient transport subsidy for low-income families. It was cut in last year's budget. There are people missing appointments because they cannot afford the bus and the copay on the same day. It should not be one or the other. Carolyn was still, then done. The palliative care extended visiting hours. The policy cuts off family access at 8 p.m. for people in the last weeks that needs a formal review. I'll bring it to the board this month. Then we can talk about my conditions, Remy said. She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her expression settled, the way a structure settles when the right load-bearing thing is finally in its correct place. You negotiate, she said, like someone who understands what things actually cost. I do, he said. He left the hospital at 10:20 with the morning fully arrived around him. Pale October light cutting low across the parking lot, the city moving at its ordinary pace as though nothing unusual had happened 40 floors above it, which was more or less true from where the city stood. He was still in his security uniform. He hadn't thought to change. He sat in his car for a while without starting it. Through the hospital's main entrance, he could see the lobby, the photographs along the wall, the quiet morning movement of a building that had come very close to becoming something else and hadn't. There was no announcement yet. There wouldn't be, not for days. But the building felt different to him now in the way that places feel different once you've seen what they nearly lost. His phone buzzed. His mother, Isla, is asking if you're coming for breakfast. He typed back, on my way. He drove through streets that were wide awake. School buses, early commuters, the particular Canadian autumn light that made the city look almost too clear, as though it had been rinsed in the night. At the corner where his mother's street met the main road, Isla was standing on the front step in her coat and backpack, watching for his car with the concentrated attention of a child who has learned that watching is something you can do to help time move. She waved when she spotted him, a full, unhesitating wave, the kind that meant she'd been there a while. He parked and got out. She came down the steps and stopped in front of him, looking at his uniform with the straightforward assessment she'd developed lately. You didn't change, she said. Long night, he told her. She considered this with the serious expression that had been appearing more often recently, the one that made her seem older than 9. Did something happen at the hospital? He crouched down to fix the zipper on her backpack, which was open the way it always was. Something almost happened, he said, and then it didn't. Isla thought about this because of you. He looked at her, because someone noticed. She accepted this with the quiet nod she gave things that made sense to her and turned toward the door where breakfast was waiting. She was almost inside when she turned back. Dad, are you going to have the same job? He thought of the folded paper in his jacket pocket. He thought of Carolyn across the empty boardroom table, of Dara's hands moving across the keyboard in the dark of early morning, of a corridor at 4:30, and a number lying on the floor that had refused to let him walk past it. I might have a different one, he said. We'll talk about it tonight. Isla looked at him for a moment, weighing, measuring the way she weighed things she wasn't entirely sure about. Then she went inside. Remy stood on the step in the October light in his security uniform, the city going quietly about its day around him, and he breathed. Just breathed. Across the city, behind its glass and concrete, Elgin Memorial Hospital was still standing.